Hi everyone, this is Anne from Straight Grain Patterns, and in this short video I'll be sharing 5 tips for sewing curved edges. As an example, I'll be using this color for my teeny pattern because obviously it has a lot of curves. But even a regular color can be a challenge. When it comes to sewing curves, there are 2 things that can go wrong. The first one is getting angles in your edge. You want your edges to be smooth and flowy, not angular. The second thing that can go wrong is an uneven seam allowance. This isn't necessarily a problem when you sew just one piece of something. After all, who's going to notice that in some parts your seam allowance is a few millimeters off, right? But when you sew a collar, for instance, you're going to want your collar pieces to be perfectly symmetrical. And the easiest way to get that symmetry is by having a perfectly even seam allowance in both pieces. How to achieve that? These are my 5 tips. First one, when you add seam allowance to your piece, use presser foot with seam allowance, which is normally 7 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch. If you use this seam allowance, you can just line up your fabric edge with your presser foot, which makes sewing a lot easier. In my own patterns, 1 centimeter or 3/8 of an inch is a default seam allowance, but for collars and other very curved pieces, I often use 7 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch instead. Second tip, when you're sewing, don't keep your eyes on the front of your presser foot, keep it on the side at the point where the needle goes into the fabric. So look at this point, not this. That is where you want your fabric edge to line up with your presser foot, not at the front. Tip number 3, lower your stitch length. It's so much easier to sew curved edges when your stitch length is shorter. It'll make it easier to adjust, and it will also lower the chance of getting angles. Tip number 4, if the first 3 tips aren't enough, you can combine them with the following method. Sew very slowly, stitch by stitch, and with every stitch, lift your presser foot with your right hand and slightly turn your piece with your left hand, like this. So as you can see, I'm not lifting the presser foot all the way, I'm lifting it just enough to be able to turn the piece. And it's very important here that you use a short stitch length and that you only turn the piece slightly. You don't want to make a 10 or 15 degree turn at once, because then you'll get a big fat angle in your piece. I've seen people do this. They notice that they can't follow the curve anymore, and then they adjust by giving the piece a big turn. That is the best recipe for getting an angular curve, so try not to do that. And then the 5th tip, if you have an enclosed seam, don't clip your seam allowance, but trim it. Clipping your seam allowance, like I'm demonstrating here, will only increase the chance of getting angles in your curve. Instead, it is better to reduce the seam allowance to about 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. When you have an enclosed seam, this is enough to keep things together because there's no stress on the seam. So if you're making a collar, for instance, it's completely safe to trim the seam allowance instead of clipping it. Things won't come apart. So these were my 5 tips for sewing curves. Thank you for watching.